I want to start, obviously, with the biggest storyline, Brandon, and, of course, that's the quarterback situation. Drew Lock entering year 3. Teddy Bridgewater they acquired from Carolina. They did not draft a quarterback. I know we have yet to start training camp, but from what you can read into OTAs, the offseason program, how do you think, at least in the early stages, this is playing out?
Well, it's funny because Vic Fangio tries to urge us every time we talk to him to not look into this too much. And then Pat Shurmur spoke at I guess the last day of minicamp since they canceled the final practice to have a field day and kind of said the same thing. And they both said both quarterbacks looked good. But when we finally got to watch a full practice in that first day of minicamp after just watching the first day of each week of OTAs, Drew Lock, there was a bit of a gap that Teddy Bridgewater closed a little. And maybe that's understandable because Drew Lock's in year 2 in this offense with Pat Shurmur. And even though some of the concepts are familiar to Teddy Bridgewater, he got here pretty late. He's certainly locked on to Jerry Jeudy, but Drew was spreading the ball around. He was working, they keep rotating, so he was working with the second team plenty throughout the spring. And what we saw in that first day in the final week of the minicamp practice, he was lighting up the first team. Justin Simmons and Kyle Fuller and Kareem Jackson and the rest of that secondary to back up tight ends, third string tight end fullback, and then Noah Fant jumped into the second group, but 2s were beating the 1s. And Drew Lock was just kind of locked in, for lack of a better term. And so what you see with them is a higher ceiling with Drew Lock and certainly the potential for bigger pitfalls with Teddy Bridgewater, even though he was stretching the field a little bit early on in camp. But by the time we got to mini camp, we'll see what training camp holds. He was checking it down, taking what was there, which is fine. And for a defensive coach like Vic Fangio, that may be enough. But I think the excitement of what Drew Lock can bring, if it all clicks for him, you'd rather have the guy that's going to take the chances and put more points on the board.
Brandon, some months ago when Aaron Rodgers started to gripe bit about his situation with the Packers, a lot of people thought that the Broncos would be his number 1 location if it wasn't going to be California. I should say California first. But is there still a feeling out in Denver that Lock and Bridgewater are in this competition to be the guy opening day? Or is that ghost of Aaron Rodgers still floating around in the clouds? I've never believed he's going to leave the Packers, but that just happens to be me.
Well, Paul, I think to answer the question, and maybe it's cheating, but I think it's both right now. And even teammates talked about that. Von Miller talked about it at his pass rush summit in Vegas before that final week of minicamp, and teammates have talked about it. Justin Simmons said, hey, if Aaron Rodgers shows up, great, but I'm not going to deal in hypotheticals. And I think that's the way a lot of folks in Broncos country, the excitement, draft day when Adam Schefter puts a report out, and then you hear that the Broncos are high on his list, and you also find out the Niners called. I think that's all very exciting, but until Aaron Rodgers gets off a plane in Denver to come play for the Broncos, and I guess his wife or fiance's family has a house in Boulder, but that's not the same as showing up in the private jet right outside the private airport. Happens to be steps from the Broncos practice facility. So until he gets off the Broncos plane, ready to go to work, I think it's silly to spend too much time thinking about it. And so you have to focus on who's in the building right now. And so that's going to be Lock and Bridgewater. If that changes, great. And look, every time they've had a Hall of Fame quarterback late in their career, the Broncos have won Super Bowls. So the track record is there. But it seems silly to plan for Aaron Rodgers. I think it's just kind of wishful thinking. And even those of us who cover him, in the back of our minds, it's all well good. James Palmer from NFL Network is based in Denver. He has not spent very much time in Denver during the football season in recent years because they haven't been really relevant. And so he said to me the other day, he goes, look, if 12's here, he goes, I don't have to leave all season. Maybe on the Broncos bye week, he'll go say hi to Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City, but otherwise they'll basically live there. So it's fun to think about, sort of like the Deshaun Watson rumors were fun to think about until all the stuff off the field. And if that gets settled and he still wants out, maybe he becomes a Denver Bronco at some point. But I think you have to deal in the reality, and whether he stays in Green Bay or not, Aaron Rodgers isn't walking through the door now, so you have to decide who's going to help you win the most games. And for Vic Fangio, potentially keep his job. Is that Drew Lock or is it Teddy Bridgewater?
Brandon, if I can ask you a follow-up on this, because in New York, we get these crazy draft rumors and trade rumors that happen all the time. And most of them are incredibly unrealistic. From a realistic perspective, do the Broncos have the type of capital that would be necessary and the cap room that they would need to make a deal for an Aaron Rodgers? Or is this whole thing just preposterous from the get-go?
No, they do have the cap room. They're one of the teams right at the very top of the list with the most cap space right now, and everyone thinks it's earmarked and likely will end up being for guys like Cortland Sutton and Bradley Chubb on extensions and bonuses and new deals, maybe as early as the end of training camp. But with those types of deals, you can also push a lot of that money back. And if you were to trade for Aaron Rodgers, you could also rework a deal there, right, and spread his money out. But they're in really good shape cap-wise. As far as capital, what'll be interesting is if the Packers ever decide they're officially open for business, well, then what are you willing to offer? And certainly the Broncos will offer as many first-round draft picks as they can, and I think at this point it's 3. But are you willing to go over the top with players? And that's what we talked about with Deshaun Watson when people like John McClain, who, I don't know if I respect anybody that covers the NFL more, kept saying, oh, well, the Jets make the most sense, or maybe the Dolphins. Like, well, sure, and the Texans want you to say that because they have the most draft capital and the most attractive picks at the time, right? But let's say the Niners wanted to get in the mix, and they threw in Nick Bosa. I'm not saying they would. The Broncos throw in Bradley Chubb. And again, I'm not saying they would, or a Jerry Jeudy or another player, Noah Fant. Once you start putting real names out there, that's, I think, what can help sway a negotiation. But I don't think the Broncos will be the only team. If the Packers say they're open for business, what's stopping the Tennessee Titans from sending Ryan Tannehill and all their first-round picks? I know they're going to be low picks because that's a pretty good roster, certainly on offense now with the addition of Julio Jones. But I think there's going to be more teams than we think, even if we hear Aaron Rodgers would like to come to Denver. But Denver does have the capital to make the move if they want, especially if they throw in these young players, and they can afford the draft picks. Those aren't earmarked for anything else. But I don't know if they get into a real bidding war if they'll end up winning. At the same time, we know Aaron Rodgers can blow it up. He can say, I don't want to go to Nashville. I don't want to go to New Orleans or wherever. And I think they will trade him in the AFC if they do trade him. But they can't make a deal done for either of those players, Watson or Rodgers, if they truly became available.
That is the beauty of the NFL offseason. The speculation never ends, as you just laid out, Brandon. I want to return to the internal candidates and at least the reality that Denver is dealing with right now. And you alluded to this earlier, the fact that Drew Lock is entering finally, because he didn't have this luxury in college and he didn't have this luxury in his first 2 years of the NFL, where he's got the same offense, the same coordinator, the same scheme. And we experienced that here with Daniel Jones. Pat Shurmur was here, where there was a lot of movement around Daniel Jones. How much of an advantage do you think it is that Shurmur and Locke are together for the second straight year? It's a bit more of a conventional offseason, and could that very well be the difference in putting him over the top?
Well, I certainly know Drew thinks so, and people who are proponents of Drew and, talking to people in the building, I think Mike Shula, the quarterback's coach, is a big Drew Lock fan. And when you see the talent, just seeing them side by side throwing against, routes on air, warm-up stuff, you see that Drew Lock throws a different ball than Teddy Bridgewater. And so for all of his faults, which I think are mostly between his ears, you can see the physical tools that Drew Lock has. No one's going to confuse him with Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, but he's probably in that next tier of big-armed quarterbacks. And because that Missouri is running for his life and he was relying on talent, he developed a lot of bad habits. So he's changed his footwork some. He spent time with Peyton Manning in the offseason, as he told us this week, reviewing more than looking ahead, but looking at what he did differently, or what he did and what he could do differently. And just like you said, the storylines never end. The narrative isn't going to change until they go 1-4 or whatever, and then everybody's banging the door for Teddy Bridgewater. I'm not saying that's going to happen. But then you're going to say, well, I guess being with Pat Shurmur for year 2 wasn't the problem. But the 1 year he had consistency, this is going back to high school, was his sophomore into junior year at Mizzou, and he gets Josh Heupel for the second straight year and throws 44 touchdown passes, which at the time set an SEC record. And, I just mentioned Peyton Manning. He had a pretty good run in the SEC. He never threw 44 touchdowns. I know the game's changed a little, but we know that the talent's there, as I just touched on, and the upside's there. The question is, will all of it click? But the one thing that Drew did say this week was he's not spending any time learning the offense. It's just reinforcing. And with what he's been doing away from the building, whether it's studying on his own and or when he's thrown with teammates before they got in for that phase 3 work on the field, or what they'll do in the 5 weeks here before camp starts, that he knows what he's doing. Instead of guessing what he thinks he needs to do, he knows exactly what he wants to do every time he goes on the field.
Let's talk about the receivers, the guys who are going to be catching the other end of those passes. Look, we all know Cortland Sutton is a quality NFL player, my goodness, but he's coming off that torn ACL. Then you got to worry about Jerry Jeudy's drops. I saw a number that said he had 14, which was second in the NFL last season. Those two guys need to be at their best, don't they, if this passing game is going to get cooking?
You're absolutely right. Let's throw one more name in there, too, that wasn't relied on very much, but KJ Hamler. They took him in the second round, and I bet somewhere on that list that you were looking at, his name was pretty high because he had drops as well. They just weren't as high profile necessarily because he was a second round pick. He's 5'9", and he's not Jerry Jeudy coming from Alabama as most people's favorite receiver in the draft, including mine. And it was obviously a very good receiver draft. But when the Raiders at 11 took his teammate Henry Ruggs III, and you end up with Jerry Jeudy falling in the Broncos' laps, everybody in Broncos country was really excited, especially with Cortland Sutton coming off a Pro Bowl season. Of course, Cortland goes down in that second game in Pittsburgh where he tears his ACL and MCL on a bad throw from Jeff Driscoll that Cortland's trying to make a tackle on the interception, and the rest is history. But Cortland's looked really good coming off the injury. You're always going to be concerned until you know for a fact that a player's 100% and is showing no ill effects. He didn't do any teamwork in the spring, and I don't know if he'll be cleared 100% day one of training camp to go full speed. And I think it'd be silly to let him, right? You might as well ease him in, even though at that point you're looking at he's probably just 10 and a half months removed from the surgery, so he's in better shape than most. But those guys are really the key. And Jeudy, you mentioned it, Paul, the drops. He didn't drop a thing in the spring. Like I said a little earlier, he was Teddy Bridgewater's favorite target. And when you see how open he is, it's understandable. We saw the same thing, though, last year, especially because you know how they treat rookies. They don't get to run with the ones as much. When he was running second and third team, he was just putting on a clinic with how to run routes and get open, dealing with guys that maybe didn't even make the roster, right, if we were to go back and review, or certainly didn't make the opening day roster. And so this year he kind of picked up where he left off, but they talk about his renewed dedication and focus. Vic Fangio touched on that this week, that he's really trying to build off of his final game of the year, because he had that terrible game against the Chargers in Week 16, Game 15, and came back the final game against the Raiders, had a 92-yard touchdown, and caught a bunch of passes, didn't have any drops. So at least he had that to help propel him into the offseason. And it looks like he may be living up to the hype, but that drop number, when you say it out loud or you remember it if you're a Broncos fan or someone who covers the team, it was a rough year. And one more name out the ranks. I mentioned that Drew Lock had a connection with him this week. First-round pick from the same year Drew Lock was drafted just a couple of years ago. Noah Fant is back. And then Drew's favorite target at Mizzou, Albert Okwuegbunam, the speedster tight end, who also, like Noah Fant, ran the fastest 40 time. He's coming off his ACL. He may not be back Week 1, but they like where his progress is, and they think he's ahead of where they wanted to be. So that's 5 real targets on the outside that Drew's going to have a chance to throw to. Or Teddy, right? I guess I can't just kick Teddy off. I've got Drew starting September 12th in New York. Maybe I'll be wrong, but if I'm right, I've got some other folks who cover the team that are going to owe me a few cases of beer.
It adds a little bit more intrigue into the Week 1 opener between the Giants and the Broncos. There's no doubt about that. The other name that I wanted to throw out, Brandon, is Tim Patrick, because it was interesting. He really had a career year last year, and I guess my question is, how much is that a product of Cortland Sutton goes down, some of the young guys have the case of the dropsies, versus maybe him beginning to scratch the surface of a larger role in this offense moving forward?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue with Tim Patrick is going to be just figuring out who you're taking off the field to put him out there. It's one thing when Cortland Sutton's down and Jerry Jeudy and KJ Himmler are going through those rookie struggles that we saw. Excuse me. And so with Tim Patrick, it's a complete opposite. It was funny because, Pro Football Focus, which is quick to throw up tweets promoting their site and their metrics, had one during the offseason saying, here's a list of all the top receivers that didn't have any drops. And Tim Patrick tweets at him, I guess 0 drops didn't make the list. And Tim Patrick had a career year and had no drops, the complete opposite of Jerry Jeudy. Tim Patrick, to me, is also a name that could be part of a potential trade if one of those quarterbacks we talked about did truly become available. But they really like him, and talking to their personnel people, when camp started last year, it was like, no, he's not a bubble guy. He's going to start. He's going to play a lot. And we did see that throughout camp. He was starting opposite Cortland Sutton. And again, part of that was letting those rookies earn their stripes, if you will. But I think that Tim Patrick should demand playing time at the very least. And you may see a lot of Jeudy and Hamler early on rotating. And then, again, with Cortland Sutton, if he's not 100% ready to go, or if you feel like, I'll put easing him in quotes, but you don't want to give him a full 70-snap workload in weeks 1, 2, 3, 4 in that first month in September, then you might see Tim Patrick play a little more than he might later in the year if everybody's healthy and those young kids are figuring it out. But Tim Patrick is a player, and for a kid that bounced around after the Ravens caught him and was on the Broncos practice squad, living in Garrett Bowles, his college teammate's house, his whole first year in Denver. He really did make a name for himself, and if the Broncos can't find a place for him, there's other teams that would happily take him, and they could probably actually get a real draft pick back for him if they wanted to move him.
How do you expect them to use the running back core? We know what Melvin Gordon can do. He's proven in this league now for a number of years. But Javonte Williams out of North Carolina was a heck of a guy in college. And they made him a second-round pick, so you have to feel they're going to use him.
Well, and they traded up 5 spots to go get him because they heard rumblings at Miami, who was sitting there between Atlanta and Denver. I think Miami might pick 36. They weren't going to let Miami take their guy, so they jumped from 40 to 35 and go get Javonte Williams, Pookie, which is his nickname that I think he said his grandma gave him. I don't know how many of his teammates are calling him Pookie yet. But he was there all offseason in the OTAs. Melvin Gordon makes a habit of not being at OTAs and training on his own. He was there for the mandatory minicamp and was sporting a fresh haircut, cut off the dreadlocks, and said his dad told him that was going to take away his power, but he had been wanting to do it for a while. So we'll see. I think they're going to run Melvin Gordon into the ground. Now, Javonte Williams is too good to not get on the field, as you mentioned, Paul. And so I think, and we'll let your listeners that are going to be looking at a fantasy draft, I think if you're in a draft and you're looking for a back-end first running back or your second running back, Melvin Gordon should be high on that list. I think he's going to have all the touchdowns. If you're in a keeper league, grab Javonte Williams in those rounds in the middle to late rounds in the teens, and then next year you'll be getting a steal because I don't think Melvin Gordon will be back and Javonte Williams will be the featured guy. But for a guy that split his carries with Michael Carter the last couple of years in North Carolina, he's familiar with that. I don't think he's going to be demanding playing time or be a malcontent. I think he's going to learn from Melvin Gordon. And unlike last year where it seemed like every week, and there was plenty of times that they weren't out there together, I think Philip Lindsay missed 7 games and Melvin Gordon missed 1. But we would ask Pat Shurmur, hey, what's the running back split going to be? What's the workload going to be? We're not going to ask that every week, at least not early on. If Javonte Williams is playing out of his mind, then maybe we'll start. But it's Melvin Gordon's job, and it's Javonte Williams' role to spell him. They're similar in size, kind of similar in build. I think Williams may be a little quicker and might have a little more top-end speed. But I don't think when the Broncos get to MetLife on September 12th, Javonte Williams is going to be the first down running back, assuming Gordon isn't suspended at all for his off-field incident, the DUI that got pled down to less. If the league doesn't take him off the field for 1, 2, or 3 games, Melvin Gordon will be the workhorse certainly early.
We're talking with Brandon Krisztal, Broncos insider for KOA News Radio in Denver here on Giants.com. Big Blue Kickoff Live as we preview the Week 1 matchup between the Giants and the Broncos. And the run game as well as the quarterback performance, Brandon, is dependent on the play of the offensive line. And from what I understand, they have continuity working in their favor because Bobby Massey is really going to be the new guy in town at right tackle as they signed him from the Bears with Juwan James unfortunately suffering an injury. So how beneficial is the continuity factor, and how much of a step up do you think this offensive line needs to take, which was put under the microscope a bit last season?
Yeah, and I think that in large part they passed that test. Garrett Bowles specifically, for a guy that was a first-round pick, and everyone thought it was a reach when they took him, and every time there'd be a holding penalty coming, the Broncos fans would collectively hold their breath and then hear holding Broncos number 72. And you would get the audible gasp or the size or whatever. And so it was I think a big surprise to some and a pleasant surprise, certainly to have Garrett Bowles play at such a high level and be rated. I mentioned Pro Football Focus. You can take or leave their ratings, but they rate everybody, and they had Garrett Bowles rated as one of the best tackles. He played, in a lot of people's opinion, at a Pro Bowl, All-Pro level and got rewarded for it. The Broncos know what they're looking at, especially with a Hall of Fame coach and Hall of Fame player, potentially, I guess, a Hall of Fame O-line coach, and Mike Munchak, certainly one of the best teachers at that position. They weren't going to give him that deal if they didn't think he earned it and was capable of playing like this every single year and living up to that first-round talent. Then you got Dalton Reisner, who started pretty much every game since he was drafted a couple of years ago, 1 pick before Drew Lock. Lloyd Cushenberry had a rough year, but played every single snap. The only offensive player to do that at center out of LSU. He put on some strength. He's going to hold off Quinn Miners, who everyone's seen, the rookie out of Wisconsin Whitewater's belly, but that's going to be pushing him for playing time. Graham Glasgow may not be around here very long, but he's definitely going to be around here in year 2 of a 4-year, $45 million contract or whatever it is because of the guaranteed money. So you've got 4 starters back almost certainly. And then Bobby Massey I know he's been a little injury prone the last couple of years, but Vic Fangio saw him plenty in Chicago. George Paton, the GM, saw him as a guy that was obviously Rick Spielman's right-hand man with the Vikings. So they know what they have in Bobby Massey. And for Juwan James, who's maybe the worst free agent signing in the John Elway tenure, it's a battle between he or Menelik Watson. He played 63 snaps, and he couldn't get on the field his first year. There were people in the building that told John Elway not to sign him, and he did anyway. And so then he opts out. Apparently, as I heard someone say, after having COVID, he opted out last year, which I just thought was interesting. He hurts himself away from the facility. He's going to be in a legal back and forth with the Broncos, I guess, lawyers, and so it'll be interesting to see how quickly Massey can come in. But losing James isn't much of a loss. Elijah Wilkinson, who played a lot, is now penciled in to start with the Bears. A little flip-flop there with Massey. But if Massey can play up to, I guess, the expectation of a 10-year vet or whatever he is, 8, 9, 10-year vet, then that O-line is going to be better than they were in recent years, which is pretty wild because the O-line has been a thorn in the Broncos' side. Just, I guess, if quarterback is 1A, and it certainly is, O-line play has been 1B in terms of the list of problems in the post-Peyton Manning era.